Hello everyone, as I promised, this is a small video for Chapter 7. Chapter 7, just to reiterate the name of the chapter, Behavioral Views of Learning, just so I don't get it incorrect. So I was referring to my text. It really does kind of cover this idea of what is learning. It just gives you a general definition. I think that's kind of interesting. The way Woolfolk describes it is anything or any modality that changes a behavior. So it's a very, very broad look at what learning is. And that kind of goes into the whole chapter, which is kind of this behavioral perspective, or one way in which we look that in which we can affect students and that students learn, and it's looking at the behavioral perspective. One person that's very much a behavioral theorist is Albert Bandura. I happen to be a big fan of his writings, a lot of them that were mid-80s to 90s. He did a lot of writings on social and emotional context with regard to behavior, a lot of fortuitous encounters and how those behaviors affect us during our lives. So just in a broad sense, I like the psychology that that is encompassed in his work. One of the interesting things I like about this chapter is the depth that it goes to in talking about the conditioning that occurs with students, especially operant conditioning. It does cover some of the ideas of what conditioning is. I think we're all pretty familiar with some of the early experiments with regard to conditioning and how we can see those responses in our students. It does go into behavior management, and I think that's probably one of the biggest concerns for students sitting in your seat. If I ask you what is your biggest fear about being a teacher, most people will say, I fear behavior management. I fear that I won't be able to manage my class, and I just want to reiterate that's a very, very natural fear. I'm not sure that it's something that's necessarily I don't think it's something that should necessarily take up a lot of your time as far as being a fear. I think it's something you work through, and the more you get experience with it, the better you get at it. So the chapter outlines a lot of interesting looks at how we manage students' behavior, from undesirable behavior to just the idea of complimenting a student or praising a student and the authenticity that should come along with that. Another thing it talks about is intervals with regard to reinforcements of behavior. And what we know in a classroom, it's very much Harry Wong type first days of school type of application. It's really not a theory per se, but it's definitely a strategy that I do believe in, is that when you start in your classroom, you have to do something every day, all the time, and it has to become a routine. And those routines that you do every day and you repeat over and over, as far as the repetition, actually become procedures in your classroom. And that, to me, is fundamentally how your class becomes very well managed, in that you follow a pattern every day, you reinforce that every day, and then it becomes a mindset. And so if you think about it in an everyday sense, how many of you, when you're tired, get up, you take a shower, you do things in a certain order of events, and if something disrupts you, then you forget to, I don't know, brush your teeth or put deodorant on, and then you realize you've gotten to work and one of these very important things has not happened. It's the same way in a classroom structure. You have to reinforce those behaviors day in and day out for a period of time until all of a sudden your students start doing those things without you even telling them that's what you expect. And that's where those routines become a procedure in your classroom of how we pass out papers, or how we hand in papers, or the routine of getting in line and getting ready to go outside or go to lunch, or just how I handle electronic documents in a secondary classroom and what I expect from you. And when you train your students in those very, very small steps, those small steps eventually become their small steps, and you don't have to tell them anymore, they just do it. And your classroom starts to magically run by itself, but that only happens if you reinforce those behaviors every day. And then the book talks about reinforcement of behaviors in that, you may not have to do that every day. After that routine, that everyday routine of just, let's say, passing out papers becomes a procedure, and students just know what they expect, what is expected. The reason you have to reinforce those behaviors is things will throw them off. Just as I said, when you get up in the morning and you have a routine, something throws you off, you've had an interrupter and you forget to brush your teeth. It's the same things in a classroom that happens every day. A student gets sick, you have snow starts falling from outside your window and everybody acts crazy, and all of a sudden they can't remember what their routine or they were supposed to do. Or maybe you have an assembly, or you have a special guest in your school, or maybe it's the day before a big break. Or maybe it's a Monday they had off from school and they come back Tuesday and they just act like crazies. I mean, there's all kinds of things that affect students' behavior that we don't even think about. And we have to be willing to go back to that reinforcement mode to get students back on track in a very, very general sense. And so that's something to think about, is you don't have to be on students all the time with regard to what you expect from them. It just needs to be intermittent, as the book says, after the point of you really reinforcing, this is what I expect, whether it's a behavior in the classroom or it's a procedure and routine in the classroom. One of the things I know to be very, very successful at any level is that we have this very holistic idea of what we expect in a classroom. That is, we'll sit down, we'll raise our hand, we'll be someone in control of our behavior. And students figure that out, what is expected from them, very, very early. And so one of the interesting things, I think, as far as building a sense of community in your classroom and managing it as such, is letting students decide the rewards and consequences based on the rules in your class. So you actually sit with the students and you go through a list of, and I don't really like the word rules, I like the word guidelines. These are the guidelines that we want to set out. This is how our family or our class should operate for all of us to be successful and for all of us to learn. And when you give the students that power to actually make those guidelines, then all of a sudden there's buy-in. And you say, okay, so what are my, like, come up with, in a K through 6 environment, 5 rules is plenty. And I would even say even 3, because a lot of those can go back to this idea of just being respectful of other individuals, and that covers a host of ideas of what respect is, and it opens up conversations. But when you ultimately give the power to your students to decide what is and isn't acceptable, then they also get to decide what are rewards and what are consequences for when I don't do those things, or I do those things very well. And when you turn that into giving them power, it gives them a sense of entitlement and ownership to the classroom. It's like letting them put artwork up in your classroom versus you designing every bulletin board. It gives them this sense of community and pride, and that they really do belong to this greater family, so to speak. So lastly, the biggest thing I would say is, when you give ownership to your students, it may feel like something that's going to get out of control, but you would be amazed that students as young as 1st and 2nd grade already know what is expected of them. They could come up with a list of rules that you would probably find acceptable, because most of those rules are rules they've been taught from parents or guardians, that they've been taught in preschool, they've been taught in kindergarten. And I just think it's an interesting concept to allow the power to go back to your students, when you still have power over them too. So those are just a few points that I wanted to make with regard to chapter 7, some of the things that we talk about in class. Another thing I fully love about this textbook, that I think is the most practical bit of knowledge that you can take from any Woolfolk text, and especially this chapter, is anything that appears as what is called a guideline. And they're usually at the top of the pages. There's 4 or 5 contained in every chapter. And I like those because those are the practical pieces of knowledge that you can take with you, that you would tend to remember because they are practical in nature. So anyway, I will cut this off at 8 minutes. I'm sorry I talked so long. These are things that I know to be true, that I've worked in the classroom, and that I'm truly passionate about. So anyway, chapter 7, if I think of anything else, I'll make another quick video, but I promise not to do that to you. So anyway, have a good week. I will talk to you next week when we start to encounter chapter 8, and we will move from there. So if you have any questions, send me emails. I'm glad to hear from you. I've had some of you actually stop in my office, which is a nice treat. So anyway, have a great week, and I will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.